When we think of Britain, we usually picture a massive global conqueror. But for its first 1600 years, the island was a constant target. For centuries, outsiders saw the island as a prize to be taken. The Romans marched in 2,000 years ago to lay down infrastructure, followed by successive waves of Germanic tribes, Vikings, and eventually the Normans from France. By the 1500s, after a messy split from the Catholic Church, England found itself highly vulnerable. It was a restless, Protestant island isolated in a sea of wealthy, hostile neighbors. Looking at this position, the push to build an empire starts to make sense. It didn't come from an inherent desire to rule the globe, but from a desperate need to survive in a highly dangerous neighborhood. That defensive desperation hit a peak in 1588. Catholic Spain, the undisputed superpower of the era, sent a massive armada to crush the weak English fleet once and for all. Against all odds, the tiny island faced down Europe's greatest navy and won. Defeating the Spanish fleet proved the island could hold its own, injecting England with a massive surge of national confidence. Defeating Spain changed how the island viewed the water. The surrounding ocean was no longer just a barrier to keep invaders out, it was a highway to access the rest of the world. To guarantee they would never be cornered again, they realized the most effective strategy was to project power as far outward as possible. But the earliest mechanism of this global reach was entirely private. The initial expansion was driven by the East India Company, a ruthless corporation motivated entirely by shareholder profit rather than any kind of national pride. This map tracks exactly how that private operation scaled. Initially, they focused on securing trade deals, but soon the company pivoted. They began raising private armies, winning battles, and taking over actual governance, which allowed them to collect taxes directly from regions like Bengal. Prioritizing the ledger over human life had catastrophic results. When a famine hit Bengal in 1770, millions starved to death, yet the company's clerks and governors ensured the tax revenue kept flowing back to London. This corporate framework made the empire incredibly agile. When 13 of their American colonies successfully rebelled, the British simply redirected their ambition southward, planting penal colonies and wheat fields in Australia to keep the machine running. By treating human lives and foreign lands as expendable assets on a spreadsheet, this corporate imperialism allowed Britain to scale at an aggressive, uninterrupted rate. To maintain this sprawling, decentralized network of wealth, the company needed an ultimate enforcement tool to protect its sea routes. That tool was the Royal Navy. In 1805's at the Battle of Trafalgar, Admiral Nelson shattered the combined French and Spanish fleets, effectively removing any remaining threats to British ocean dominance. Back home, a second force multiplier was coming online, the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines and coal-fed machines gave this tiny island the mechanical capacity to outproduce entire continents. These two forces created a self-sustaining loop. The Navy protected the ships extracting raw cotton and tea, the domestic factories manufactured those materials into finished goods, and the empire forced global markets to buy them back. Fusing an unstoppable navy with a hyper-productive industrial economy effectively turned London into the banker of the world, making the empire look nearly invincible. By the late 1800s, the empire reached its maximum physical stretch. Under Queen Victoria, London controlled a quarter of the Earth's landmass and hundreds of millions of subjects. Yet this massive scale required a deep level of moral decay. At home, the industrial boom was built on the backs of children working brutal hours in city slums, while abroad, policies of extraction exacerbated the devastation of the Irish potato famine. The breaking point for corporate rule finally arrived in 1857. An uprising by Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, forced the British government to step in, strip the East India Company of its power, and assume direct control over India. An empire built entirely on extraction reaches a hard mathematical limit the moment the cost of suppressing its citizens outweighs the wealth being extracted from them. But that math completely collapsed in 1914. The exact industrial methods Britain had perfected to dominate global trade were suddenly redirected into the world's first industrial war. To survive the trenches of World War I, the empire had to funnel millions of its own colonial subjects, Indians, Canadians, and Australians, into a horrific meat grinder. A generation later, World War II presented an even deeper existential crisis. For a time, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, enduring relentless bombing campaigns that flattened its own cities. By 1945, Britain stood on the winning side of the war, but had spent its entire national fortune to get there. The geopolitical reality was unavoidable. A nation cannot project authority across a global empire when its own economy is shattered and its infrastructure lies in ruins. Recognizing this exhaustion, the colonies seized the moment. They saw that Britain lacked the finances and the military strength to hold them, and they began demanding their freedom. The empire's most valuable asset fell first. Years of mass protest and Gandhi's non-violent resistance made continued British rule impossible to defend, forcing the independence and partition of India in 1947. That triggered a domino effect across Africa, the Middle East, and the Caribbean. Knowing they could not fund a dozen separate wars of retention, the British government chose to sign treaties and lower flags. In an attempt to salvage some global influence, Britain established the Commonwealth, a voluntary network designed to connect former colonies through shared trade, language, and history, rather than military force. Stripped of its physical territories, Britain had to accept that its remaining leverage on the world stage would rely entirely on diplomacy and cultural ties. The definitive end of the imperial era was finalized in 1997, when Britain handed its final major colony, Hong Kong, back to China. Forced to retreat back to its original borders, the country had to pivot. It poured its remaining resources into reinventing London, transforming the old imperial capital into a modern global financial hub. But losing that global purpose exposed deep domestic fractures. From Scottish independence movements to sectarian violence in Northern Ireland to the economic fracture of Brexit, the island has struggled to pull itself together. Despite these internal divisions, the legacy of its global reach is permanent. Its music, language, and institutions still carry outsized weight around the world today. From an island carved up by invaders to a global corporate giant, and finally to a modern financial hub, the story of Britain is one of constant reinvention. It survived before the empire began, and its survival today depends on that exact same ability to adapt to a world that no longer waits for its lead.